Welcome the Lord's chosen. Paper outlives promises. That's the bitter truth about inheritance battles. They don't play out in whispers at family dinners or in late-night arguments about who deserved what. They play out in cold, air-conditioned courtrooms where signatures matter more than sob stories and where a single clause in a will can flip generations of entitlement upside down. What's even wilder? Studies show that over 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation, not because of bad business, but because of these very inheritance wars. The courtroom isn't just a stage. It's a battlefield where bloodlines, betrayals, and bank accounts collide in brutal clarity. Now imagine walking into that arena as the chosen one, already painted as the villain, not because you stole, but because you actually won. The glares, the fake tears, the rehearsed speeches about family honor, all of it crashing against one undeniable fact. The law didn't bend for theatrics, it bowed to the ink. And the moment the verdict echoed, you weren't just the heir, you were the headline. Suddenly you weren't only holding deeds and documents, you were holding the weight of accusations, the simmering rage of cousins who thought entitlement was currency, and the whispered threats that had everyone clutching pearls like criminal charges were seconds away from being announced. Funny thing is, they wanted the court to strip you bare, but instead it stripped them, revealing greed dressed as grief, jealousy disguised as justice, and entitlement masquerading as love. That's the inheritance game, not a story of who mourned hardest, but of who understood that legacy is a chessboard. And the one who reads the fine print controls the kingdom. And you didn't just play the game, you changed the rules. Number one, they confused justice with sentiment. That's the core of why they failed, and it's a mistake more common than people admit. Inheritance cases are not built on who cried the loudest, who told the most heartfelt stories, or who spent the most years around the deceased. Courts don't calculate grief. Judges aren't swayed by childhood memories or emotional appeals that sound convincing in family gatherings. The courtroom has one language, and that language is law. Sentiment may feel powerful in the moment, but it evaporates the second it collides with legal fact. What happened here was simple yet devastating for them. They assumed the law would give weight to feelings. The countless phone calls they claimed to have made, the nights they said they stayed up caring, the sacrifices they paraded in testimony. They thought the judge would see their love and reward them accordingly. But love isn't written in contracts, and sacrifices don't override signatures. A will doesn't bend because someone shouts about loyalty. What mattered was the paper trail. Who the deceased trusted enough to put in writing. That's what the law recognizes and nothing else. This is why their entire argument collapsed. They built their case on sentimentality, and while it may have stirred some people in the gallery, it meant nothing to the court. Sentiment is fragile when exposed to scrutiny. You can claim you loved, you can claim you gave, but unless it is backed by documented truth, it's just theater. And in this battle, theater didn't win. It only embarrassed them further. Their grief became a performance, and their entitlement revealed itself in the cracks between their words. The brilliance of this moment is that it teaches something deeper. Justice and sentiment don't walk hand in hand. Sentiment can make you feel righteous, but justice requires proof. Too many people think inheritance is a moral judgment, as though the court will declare who was the better child, who cared more, or who deserved love the most. But the court isn't a family therapist. It isn't there to heal wounds or crown the most deserving sibling. It is there to execute what the deceased already decided and to enforce the law with precision. They lost not because they didn't feel, but because they never understood that in the world of inheritance, feelings are noise and justice is ink. Number two, their greed testified louder than any witness. They didn't need enemies in the courtroom because their own behavior betrayed them. Greed has a way of exposing itself without words, and in inheritance battles, it shows up in the smallest gestures, the sharpest interruptions, and the desperate insistence on grabbing more than what was ever promised. Every time they spoke, every time they argued, it wasn't love or loyalty that came through. It was hunger. Hunger for assets, hunger for recognition, hunger for control. And that hunger became the strongest evidence against them. What courts look for is credibility. If your words don't align with your actions, your case collapses, no matter how polished your arguments sound. They entered the room claiming to fight for fairness, but their reactions told another story. They interrupted proceedings, tried to discredit the will, painted you as the manipulator, and even twisted memories to suit their agenda. They wanted to look like the aggrieved party, but their obsession with the money, the property, and the status made their true motives impossible to hide. In the eyes of the court, they stopped being reliable heirs and started looking like opportunists. Greed leaves a trail that no lawyer can erase. It's in the contradictions between what they said and what they demanded. One minute, they spoke of family unity. The next, they were tearing apart the very bonds they claimed to protect. One moment, they mourned the deceased. The next, they were calculating what percentage they could seize. The more they pushed, the more they exposed themselves. They thought they were cornering you, but in reality, they cornered themselves with their own ambition. What made it worse was how their greed amplified the strength of your position. While you stood on documentation and legality, they stood on desire and entitlement. That imbalance made it easy for the court to see the truth. Judges don't reward desperation, they penalize it when it crosses into manipulation. Their greed was a louder testimony than any witness statement could ever be. It proved beyond words that they weren't seeking justice but advantage. And when greed takes center stage in a courtroom, it doesn't just weaken a case, it destroys it from the inside out. That's why they lost before the verdict was even spoken. Their appetite for more testified against them long before the judge declared it. Number 3, the dead spoke through paper, not tears. That's the reality many people don't want to accept when inheritance battles begin. Once a person is gone, their intentions no longer live in arguments, recollections, or family stories. They live in the legal documents they left behind. A will is not just a piece of paper. It's their final voice, their last directive, their way of saying who they trusted, who they valued, and who they wanted to protect. And no matter how loud the living cry, no matter how passionately they insist on their version of history, the law listens to what was written, not what is remembered. This truth unsettles people because it strips them of power. Tears, memories, and emotional speeches may sway friends and family, but they do not sway courts. Courts are not arenas of sentiment, they are places where clarity wins. The deceased already made their choice long before the case ever reached a judge, and that choice was sealed in ink. That's why inheritance cases often feel brutal. It's not the court deciding against someone, it's the deceased speaking for themselves one last time. The court simply enforces their voice. In this case, the mistake your opponents made was assuming their grief gave them leverage. They thought mourning loudly would move the scales in their favor. But grief has no legal weight. No judge can translate tears into ownership. The law is designed this way because emotions shift, but contracts endure. What matters is not who is hurting the most, but whose name the deceased wrote down when they were alive and clear-headed. That paper becomes the ultimate testimony, stronger than any witness, stronger than any accusation. The beauty and the cruelty of it lie in the same truth. The dead cannot be cross-examined. Their word is final because it has been preserved in writing. And that preservation shuts down speculation, arguments, and revisionist history. When the paper was presented, it silenced the noise. All the back and forth, the accusations, the sentimental appeals collapsed under the weight of documented intent. The deceased spoke clearly, not with raised voices, but with signed pages. That's why you won. Not because you shouted the loudest, but because the one person who truly mattered had already spoken before they left this world. And their words, written and sealed, carried more power than any living voice in the room. Number 4, legacy is not something that gets decided in the heat of arguments or in the drama of a courtroom. It is decided long before anyone gathers in front of a judge. The truth about inheritance is that by the time lawyers are called and relatives are lining up to stake their claims, the outcome has already been written. A will, a trust, a signature. These are not just documents. They are the deceased person's final act of authority. It is their way of saying, this is how I want my story to end, and these are the people I choose to carry it forward. The courtroom doesn't create legacy, it simply enforces it. This is where many people miscalculate. They walk into court thinking they can argue their way into a different destiny, as though passion or persistence could rewrite ink. But the ink is already dry. No amount of outrage, persuasion, or emotional display can undo the fact that the person whose assets are in dispute already made their choice. Legacy is not a debate. It's a decision that the deceased locked into place when they were alive, when they had the clarity to weigh their relationships, their experiences, and their trust in the people around them. What makes this point so powerful is how it reveals entitlement for what it truly is: blindness. Those who felt certain they were heirs assumed that legacy was an open question, something to be fought over after death. They didn't realize it had already been settled. They thought the court was the arena for destiny, but the court was only the executor of a decision that had already been made privately years before. That's why their anger burned so hot, because they were not fighting you, they were fighting the unchangeable. They were fighting the past. And here's the sharp edge of it. Legacy is intentional, not accidental. The deceased didn't leave things to chance. They put names on paper, sealed decisions, and left a trail of instructions. That is where the true inheritance battle is fought. In the moment of writing, not in the moment of reading. By the time the case reached its climax, you weren't winning a fight. You were simply standing where destiny had already placed you. Their disbelief only proved how far removed they were from the truth. Legacy wasn't written in their arguments. It was already etched in ink, waiting for the day it would be enforced. Number 5, bloodline has always carried weight in the minds of families, but when it comes to inheritance, it doesn't hold the power people assume. Being born into a family doesn't automatically entitle anyone to what that family has built. Biology connects people by blood, but the law doesn't reward DNA. It rewards preparation, documentation, and legal foresight. Courts don't divide assets based on who shares the closest genetic makeup. They divide them based on what has been signed, recorded, and legally secured. That's why so many heirs are shocked when they discover that family ties alone cannot unlock the vault. The mistake many make is assuming that lineage is enough. They believe that because they carry the same last name, or because they can trace themselves directly to the deceased, they automatically deserve a share. But entitlement without documentation is just an illusion. Judges aren't moved by family traditions, old photographs, or the stories of sacrifices that parents or grandparents may have made for their children. The law doesn't care about assumptions. It honors the choices the deceased took the time to formalize, whether those choices favor blood relatives or outsiders who proved their loyalty and trust in more tangible ways. This exposes a deeper truth. Inheritance is not about fairness in the way most families define it. It's about intent and clarity. The deceased had the power to decide who carried their legacy, and that power was locked in the moment they signed the documents. Kinship may give you a claim to memory, but unless it was backed by foresight, it's powerless in court. That's why many families fracture over estates. One side leans on blood while the other leans on law, and law always wins. What makes this lesson sting is how it redefines family itself. Some of the closest relatives discover that they were never chosen, not because they weren't blood, but because blood alone wasn't enough. The deceased wanted their legacy in the hands of those they trusted, not simply those they were related to. That's the brutal honesty of inheritance. Biology can connect people, but it doesn't guarantee responsibility, loyalty, or wisdom. Without foresight, bloodline is nothing more than DNA on paper. It may carry history, but it doesn't carry entitlement. In the courtroom, kinship without legal backing dissolves into nothing more than biology, a fact that can't outweigh ink. Number 6, they thought morality could outrun legality, and that was their downfall. Inheritance disputes often trigger moral debates within families: who sacrificed the most, who stood by the deceased in their hardest times, who deserves the reward. Those arguments may hold emotional weight at family gatherings, but they don't translate into legal victories. The courtroom isn't built to measure fairness in the way people imagine. Judges don't hand out verdicts based on who acted nobly or who seems most deserving. They rely on evidence, documents, and the framework of law. That's the only currency that counts. This is where they miscalculated. They tried to build their case on moral appeals, insisting that the estate should be divided according to what felt fair in their eyes. They pointed to sacrifices, obligations, and even the character of the heirs involved, as if morality could rewrite legal agreements. But morality is subjective. What one person sees as fairness, another sees as favoritism. Courts cannot rule on feelings that shift depending on who is telling the story. They can only rule on facts that stand regardless of opinion. Wills, trusts, contracts, and other evidence that doesn't bend to perception. By relying on morality, they revealed their lack of preparation. It was a strategy rooted in desperation rather than strength. If they had the evidence, they would not have needed to plead fairness in the first place. Every time they leaned on moral arguments, it exposed the weakness of their position. The irony is that morality can be a double-edged sword. The very examples they used to prove their fairness also highlighted their contradictions. They claimed to honor family values while tearing the family apart. They claimed selflessness while openly demanding a larger share. Their version of morality unraveled under its own hypocrisy. The truth is that legality always outpaces morality in inheritance battles. The law exists precisely to cut through subjective claims of fairness. It doesn't mean morality is unimportant in life, but in the courtroom it is powerless without proof. They forgot that, and it cost them everything. Evidence stood like a wall they couldn't climb, no matter how passionately they argued. In the end, morality might win hearts, but it doesn't win cases. They lost because they tried to replace facts with feelings, forgetting that fairness is just opinion, while legality is binding. Number 7. The real heir prepares, while others assume. That's the difference between walking into court with confidence and stumbling in with entitlement. Many people treat inheritance as something automatic, a birthright that will fall into their laps simply because they share blood with the deceased. They assume their place is guaranteed, that no preparation is required, and that the law will bend to the idea of family tradition. But inheritance doesn't reward assumptions. It rewards foresight, strategy, and readiness. You'd already done the work long before the courtroom lights came on. While others were counting on unspoken promises or family hierarchy, you positioned yourself legally and strategically. That meant understanding the documents, ensuring everything was in order, and being present where it truly mattered. Not just during celebrations, but in the serious moments where decisions were being put to paper. Preparation isn't glamorous, but it's powerful, and when the time came, it was your preparation that stood taller than their assumptions. Their downfall was rooted in complacency. They believed proximity was enough. They thought being the eldest, the closest, or the most deserving in their eyes would secure them a place in the inheritance. But entitlement has never been a substitute for action. The deceased wasn't swayed by assumptions either. They chose someone who demonstrated readiness, responsibility, and loyalty in ways that could be trusted when it mattered most. That choice wasn't sentimental, it was intentional. The truth about inheritance is that it mirrors life. Those who prepare shape their outcomes, while those who assume get blindsided. In this case, preparation didn't just protect you, it exposed them. It showed who took responsibility seriously and who only showed up when there was something to gain. Their shock at the verdict was proof of how little they understood about the process. They thought inheritance was a gift to be handed over, but in reality it was a trust to be honored. Being the real heir isn't about waiting for blessings to fall from the sky. It's about making sure that when destiny arrives, you're already standing in the right position to receive it. You didn't luck into the inheritance, you secured it. And the difference between you and them is simple. You prepared, and they assumed. Number 8. The case didn't expose you, it exposed them. That's the part they never saw coming. They walked into the courtroom convinced that the spotlight would burn you, that your character, your motives, your every move would be dragged across the floor for scrutiny. They imagined you would be the one defending yourself against accusation after accusation. But instead, every time they spoke, every time they pressed too hard, it was their own entitlement, their own lies, and their own contradictions that lit up for everyone to see. This is the nature of truth. It doesn't need theatrics. It just needs time. And the longer they argued, the clearer it became that their story didn't hold. They tried to position themselves as victims robbed of what was rightfully theirs, but their bitterness betrayed them. Their testimonies clashed with reality, their narratives bent under cross-examination, and the more they talked, the more they revealed that greed, not justice, was driving them. What they wanted was not fairness, but advantage, and the court could see it. What exposed them most wasn't just their words, but the inconsistency of their behavior. One moment they painted you as manipulative, the next they admitted to neglecting the very relationships they claimed to value. They spoke of loyalty but contradicted themselves with stories of absence, negligence, and sudden reappearances only after the estate became an issue. Entitlement has a way of writing itself into every sentence, and theirs did exactly that. They expected inheritance to bend toward them simply because they demanded it. That arrogance showed everyone in the room what was really happening. You didn't have to attack them. You didn't even need to prove them wrong aggressively. The documents, the law, and their own actions did the work for you. That's the beauty of a solid foundation. It doesn't just stand on its own, it unmasks everything shaky around it. By the end of the trial, the picture was painfully clear. You weren't the one under a microscope. They were. Their greed, their desperation, and their contradictions had stripped them bare. The case didn't put you on trial. It revealed who they truly were. It showed the court, the family, and even themselves that the inheritance wasn't stolen from them. It was never theirs to begin with. Number 9. You weren't fighting for money. You were fighting for truth. That's the part outsiders rarely understand when they look at an inheritance case. They see the property, the bank accounts, the assets, and assume greed is what drives the dispute. But beneath all the paperwork and formalities, there was something deeper at stake. The property was just the surface prize, the visible outcome. What mattered far more was the question of loyalty, trust, and recognition, the truth of who the deceased valued when they had the power to make their final decision. When a person writes a will, they are not just distributing wealth, they are declaring who they believe will carry their legacy with integrity. That's why the fight went beyond numbers. It wasn't about square footage, land value, or financial worth. It was about affirming what the deceased already made clear, that you mattered in ways no one else could erase. The assets became proof, tangible evidence of an intangible truth. They could argue endlessly about fairness or morality, but they couldn't change the fact that when the person had the chance, they chose you. This is why the courtroom victory carried a weight no money could match. It wasn't simply about securing ownership, it was about vindication. It was about silencing the doubts, the whispers, and the accusations that you somehow manipulated your way into position. It was about the law echoing what the deceased had already written with their own hand, that their trust was with you, not with the ones now crying foul. That clarity was priceless because it cut through every illusion your opponents tried to build. The others made it about entitlement, but you stood firm on truth. And the truth didn't just protect your position, it exposed their intentions. They weren't mourning the deceased. They were mourning the loss of the narrative they had created for themselves. That's why the verdict stung so deeply for them, because it was more than a financial defeat. It was a public declaration that the one they tried to undermine was, in fact, the one who had already been chosen. So, no, you weren't fighting for money, you were fighting for the truth of who truly mattered, and the inheritance was simply the physical reflection of that truth. The real victory was knowing the deceased's voice cut through the noise, and that voice pointed to you. Number 10, they built their argument on memory, you built yours on law. That single difference decided everything. Memory, no matter how vivid, is fragile. It bends with emotion, reshapes itself under pressure, and often contradicts itself when retold. Inheritance disputes magnify this fragility because everyone suddenly remembers the past in ways that benefit their claim. One says they were always present, another says they made the greatest sacrifices, and yet another swears the deceased promised them something privately. These stories may sound convincing, but in the courtroom they dissolve the moment they are challenged. You understood something they did not. Memories may be heartfelt, but they are not binding. The law does not weigh recollections because they are subjective and impossible to prove. A judge cannot base a verdict on the nostalgia of family members competing for assets. What carries weight is what cannot be bent. Notarized documents, registered wills, and legal signatures. Those are indestructible in court because they represent choices made when the deceased was alive, lucid, and deliberate. Every time they leaned on memory, they exposed the weakness of their case. Their testimonies clashed with each other, small inconsistencies turning into major cracks. One relative remembered a promise of property, another remembered being told something entirely different. In the end, their stories didn't just fade, they contradicted themselves. Meanwhile, your side didn't need to exaggerate or embellish. You had the will, the signatures, the legal validation that stood no matter how much they tried to dispute it. The more they argued from memory, the stronger the ink looked by comparison. That is the brutal beauty of law. It doesn't bend to sentiment or to the chaos of human recall. It honors what was written, stamped, and secured in a way that memory never could. That's why your foundation never shook. While they were busy digging through recollections, you stood anchored in the permanence of the law. By the time the verdict was read, the contrast was undeniable. Their case collapsed under the weight of fading stories, and yours endured because notarized ink does not fade. They thought memory could stand as evidence. But memory fades, memory fractures, and memory lies. The law does not, and that is why you won. Number 11. Their outrage became evidence of weakness. What they thought would make them look passionate and convincing only exposed the cracks in their case. Inheritance disputes are emotional by nature, but emotion without substance quickly turns into a liability. Every time they raised their voices, every time they interrupted, every time they tried to intimidate the room with anger, it told the court one thing: they had no solid ground to stand on. Judges and lawyers are trained to read beyond words. They watch body language, tone, and reactions. Outrage in a courtroom doesn't come across as strength. It comes across as desperation. It signals that a person has run out of facts and is now leaning on theatrics to fill the gap. That's exactly what happened here. Their anger wasn't a sign of conviction, it was an admission of emptiness. They could not rely on documents or airtight evidence, so they tried to substitute noise for proof. But in a courtroom, noise doesn't win cases. It weakens them. The irony is that their outbursts did the work of discrediting them. Instead of exposing you, their behavior exposed themselves. A calm judge is far less persuaded by shouting than by well-prepared arguments, and every time they exploded, it confirmed that they had no preparation to fall back on. The very thing they thought would make them look strong instead painted them as unstable and untrustworthy. Anger may feel powerful in the moment, but when measured against calm, deliberate evidence, it shrinks into nothing but proof of weakness. What sealed it was how predictable their outrage became. Whenever the other side presented documents, wills, signatures, notarized clauses, they had no counter but to lash out. That pattern revealed more than they realized. It showed the court that their entire strategy rested on emotion, not law. Once that became clear, the verdict was never really in doubt. The court doesn't reward those who argue the loudest. It rewards those who stand on unshakable proof. By the end, their rage didn't make them look wronged, it made them look defeated before the decision was even spoken. Their outbursts became evidence in themselves, the clearest sign that they weren't fighting from strength but from lack. And in a place where only facts matter, outrage became their confession of weakness. Number 12. Inheritance is proof that silence isn't weakness. In a world where people mistake noise for strength, nothing is more striking than winning without raising your voice. You didn't need to match their shouting, their accusations, or their endless claims of unfairness. The power was already in your corner, sealed in the will, structured in the clauses, and upheld by the law. Silence in this case wasn't passivity, it was strategy. It was the confidence of someone who knows the outcome doesn't rest on volume, but on truth written in ink. Every time they tried to provoke you, waiting for an emotional slip, you held your ground. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was composure that highlighted the strength of your position. While they fought with noise, you fought with facts, and facts have no need to shout. They sit quietly, unshaken, waiting for their turn to be presented. That's why your silence carried more weight than all their accusations combined. The court could see it too. Judges are not moved by theatrics, they are moved by clarity. Your calm wasn't just dignity, it was proof you were standing on solid ground. The irony is that their attacks only strengthened the meaning of your silence. With every accusation, every attempt to drag your name through the mud, your refusal to engage made them look unstable. You didn't need to defend yourself against their noise, because the documents defended you already. The will, the legal clauses, the notarized words, those were your voice. They spoke louder than anything you could have said in retaliation, and unlike emotions, they could not be twisted or erased. This is the hidden truth about inheritance disputes. It's not the one who shouts the loudest who wins, but the one who comes armed with undeniable proof. You didn't need to wrestle in the mud of emotional drama because the law had already cleared your path. Your silence wasn't surrender, it was discipline. It was the posture of someone who understands that noise fades, but evidence endures. In the end, your silence wasn't emptiness. It was assurance. It was the quiet strength of someone who didn't need to prove their worth through outbursts. The law spoke for you, the will confirmed you, and the clauses sealed you. And that's why silence, far from being weakness, was the loudest victory of all. Number 13. They didn't lose to you. They lost to the deceased's decision. That's the reality they refused to accept from the beginning. In their minds, you were the obstacle, the person standing between them and what they thought they were owed. They poured their anger onto you, painted you as the enemy, and convinced themselves that if they could just discredit you, they would win. But the truth is, you weren't the one who sealed their fate. The one they should have been contending with was no longer alive. The will had already spoken. The decision had already been made. The court was not choosing sides, it was simply upholding the voice of the deceased. This is the hard truth about inheritance. It is not a competition once the documents are signed. The person whose assets are in question has already distributed their loyalty, their trust, and their vision of legacy. They did it when they were alive and fully aware of the consequences. That decision is the foundation, and the courtroom only enforces what was already determined long before arguments began. The fight was never truly against you, it was against a decision they could not undo. What made it sting more for them was the realization that the deceased's choice was deliberate. Wills don't write themselves. Every name on that paper, every clause, every distribution reflects thought, judgment, and intent. To them, it felt like favoritism or betrayal. But in reality, it was clarity. The deceased knew exactly what they wanted and trusted the law to make it stand after they were gone. That meant their anger wasn't directed at someone who manipulated the process. It was directed at the truth of being left out. Their defeat was inevitable because they weren't battling a living opponent who could be pressured or shamed into backing down. They were battling a final decision written in ink, immune to persuasion and immune to emotion. They were fighting fate, and fate does not negotiate. That's why their case collapsed, no matter how aggressively they argued. By the end, it became clear that you weren't their problem. You didn't create the will. You didn't assign yourself the inheritance. All you did was honor what had already been put in place. They didn't lose to you. They lost to the one who made their intentions known before leaving this world. And against that kind of finality, they never stood a chance. Number 14, you walked out with more than assets. You walked out with exposure. That was the true weight of the verdict, heavier than the keys to property or the transfer of wealth. What the courtroom revealed wasn't just who inherited, but who each person really was when the mask slipped. Inheritance disputes have a way of stripping people bare. They expose loyalties, resentments, and hidden motives in ways that no family gathering ever could. By the time it was over, everyone watching knew exactly where each person stood, who had been genuine, who had been greedy, and who had been foolish enough to believe inheritance could be claimed through noise after the funeral. Wealth may have been the headline, but character became the story. Your victory made it clear that loyalty is proven in life, not demanded in death. Those who tried to rewrite history with emotional performances ended up revealing their true motives instead. Their desperation to grab what wasn't theirs showed more than words ever could. And once exposed, that image cannot be undone. People may forget the details of the trial, but they will never forget how greed distorted faces, how entitlement turned into rage, and how selfishness drowned out any pretense of grief. That's the irony of inheritance battles. The assets are finite, but the exposure lasts forever. The money can be spent, the property can change hands, but the stain of greed doesn't wash off. Every person who sat in that courtroom or heard about the case now knows who stood for what. You walked out not just with the inheritance, but with vindication, the undeniable proof that you were chosen, trusted, and written into legacy, while others were exposed as opportunists. The deeper win here is that exposure reshapes memory. When people look back on this story, they won't just talk about who got the house or the land. They'll talk about how the case revealed the true nature of those involved. They'll remember who handled it with composure and who unraveled in desperation. And that memory will outlive the inheritance itself. So yes, you left with assets, but that wasn't the real prize. The real prize was the truth laid bare for everyone to see. Loyalty was confirmed, greed was unmasked, and foolishness was immortalized, and that kind of exposure is worth far more than money could ever buy. When the dust of the courtroom finally settled, it became clear that this battle was never about who shouted the loudest, who played the victim, or who claimed the moral high ground. It was about what had already been written long before arguments began. Ink on paper, intent made permanent, and a legacy sealed by the deceased. Every outburst, every desperate claim, every emotional plea only exposed the truth. Inheritance isn't earned after the funeral, it is secured in life, in decisions that cannot be overturned by noise or entitlement. You walked out not just with assets, but with something far greater. The unshakable validation that the law stood on your side, the exposure of false loyalties, and the clarity of knowing who was truly chosen and why. They didn't lose to you, they lost to the will of the one who trusted you with their legacy. And in that trust you carried out not only their wishes, but the undeniable proof that preparation and truth will always outlast performance and greed. At the end of it all, you didn't just inherit property, you inherited peace, authority, and the unspoken victory of watching masks fall. And that will echo far longer than the money, the land, or the titles ever could. This was more than a case. This was fate upheld, loyalty rewarded, and greed exposed for exactly what it was. The inheritance wasn't just given to you, it was revealed through you. And that is the kind of victory no courtroom can contain. If this story blew your mind and showed you the raw truth behind inheritance, don't let the lesson stop here. Hit that subscribe button to stay locked in for more deep dives into power, strategy, and revelations you won't hear anywhere else. Smash the like if this gave you chills, drop a comment to share your thoughts or experiences, and share this with someone who needs to see what real legacy looks like. Stay tuned because the next story is going to hit even harder. Stay blessed always.